First of all, I'm very excited about tonight, and I had just met Ambassador Bushnell and her husband Richard earlier, and we have a lot in common, and I'm even more excited about her comments in just a few minutes. But first, let me welcome all of you to our author series. And I'd like to thank, and they were here earlier, our strategic partner, the Reagan Building and International Trade Center, for all the support that they provide us throughout the year and allow us to use these facilities to put on this great programming for all of you. And so, as a reminder, if you would like to see this program again or tell your friends about it, it will be on the YouTube channel in 24 hours, so you can watch it again and again and again. It's going to be that good. So the 1998 bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were some of the deadliest foreign attacks in U.S. history. And these bombings, unfortunately, brought international fame to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and served as a terrible foreshadow of the 9/11 attacks that we all know about. And tonight we welcome to our podium Ambassador Prudence Bushnell. As U.S. Ambassador to Kenya from 1996 to 99 and a victim of the bombing, Ambassador Bushnell led the community's response to the al-Qaeda bombing in Nairobi. In Ambassador Bushnell's new book, which I would ask you all to check out, Terrorism, Betrayal, and Resilience, My Story of the 1998 U.S. Embassy Bombings, she shares her personal experience during her posting in Kenya. Ambassador Bushnell has served in leadership positions as a U.S. Foreign Service officer in India, Senegal, Kenya, Guatemala, and Washington, D.C., and she first served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the African Bureau from 93 to 96 before being nominated by President Clinton to the U.S. ambassadorship in Kenya. In 99, President Clinton nominated her for the ambassadorship in Guatemala, where she served until 2002. And her final State Department assignment was as Dean of the Leadership and Management School of the Foreign Service Institute. She received the Service to America Career Achievement Award in 2004. And after leaving the Foreign Service, Ambassador Bushnell founded the Levitt Leadership Institute at Hamilton College in New York. So please, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Prudence Bushnell. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Shank. Thank you, Ms. Lessler, and everyone associated with putting this together. I really appreciate it. And thank all of you for coming on this evening. Let me acknowledge my husband, Richard Buckley, AKA Top Spouse, and Don Ricardo, who served with me throughout various tours. Thank you for this interest in the book. This is a story about policy and people, how they interact, and what happens when you put one in front of the other. It takes place 3 years before Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda attacked our homeland in 2001. It takes place in Nairobi, Kenya, on a day, August 7th, 10:30 in the morning, 1998, beautiful spring day. I was meeting with the Minister of Commerce on the other side of a small parking lot from the embassy. We ambassadors do a lot of things, and one of the things that we do is promote U.S. trade, hence this building, yes, appropriately named. And I was on the 20th floor of a high-rise building with 2 Department of Commerce colleagues when we heard a noise that sounded like a construction boom. The embassy was located at one of the busiest downtown intersections. So imagine 14th and Pennsylvania Avenue, 13th and Pennsylvania Avenue. We had a railroad station across the street. We had a bus stop. We had absolutely no security, perimeter security, because we had no setback from the street. As I was meeting with the Minister of Commerce, a pickup truck loaded with 1,000 pounds of explosives came into that small parking lot and drew up as close as they possibly could to the embassy building, which was about 15 feet. That's how much setback we had at the time. One of the perps in the truck got out of the truck and hurled a stun grenade, hence the sound that we heard that to me must have been a construction boom, because what else would happen in a downtown busy area of an urban city? Many of the people in the room, there may have been a dozen or so, including the Minister of Commerce, got up and walked to the window. For whatever reason, I was the last person up and had taken maybe 2 or 3 steps forward when the freight train blast and boom hurled me back a few feet. And I remember the teacup rattling. We had just had tea. The building shaking, and the dreamy thought, I'm going to die. At the same time, every cell in my body was clenched for a possible fall, and all those microbes, yes, that inhabit us were saying, oh, no, you're too much good a host for us. So it was an extraordinary personal experience that can't return to reality when one of my colleagues from the Department of Commerce came rushing back into the office saying, Ambassador, we've got to get out of here. And for the next, I do not know how long, because my brain was in shock, we descended 20 flights of stairs, increasingly filled as we got lower and lower in the building, increasingly filled with people who were together as one single human being. And I was trying very hard to keep my feet on the ground as we walked down, having no idea what was happening outside. It was only when we got outside that I saw the hell of the landscape that included a 7-story office building that had been next to our embassy turned into rubble, and hundreds of people on top digging with their bare hands to get to the hundreds of survivors below. The back of the embassy had been partially shorn, and the streets were filled with glass, with charred pieces of concrete, and yes, with corpses. It was only later that I learned that this was the work of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. A few minutes after we were blown up in Nairobi, our embassy in Dar es Salaam was blown up, killing 11 people, 85 wounded. In Nairobi, 213 people lay dead, 46 of whom were U.S. government employees, among them 12 Americans. I ended up as one of the wounded, along with 5,000 others, because so many people had gone to the window when they heard the blast. My friends, if you hear a blast, duck and cover, don't go to the window. In the United States, at the time, Americans and our government were transfixed by the White House sex scandal. After sending missiles into Sudan and Afghanistan in retaliation for the bombing, everybody got back to business as usual. So we were blown up on August 7th. By mid-September, we were literally history. The media was returned to the sex scandal and the impeachment of President Clinton, and the White House turned to many other issues. Other than a required accountability review board, which takes place anytime there is loss of life or significant property damage in an embassy overseas, there was never a hearing, never a lessons learned, never an investigative report, nothing. 3 years later, I was in Guatemala with Richard when we learned that Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda attacked the homeland. Our world changed forever, and a bombing that had been ignored became history. I honestly did not want to write a book about it because I had experienced it. I didn't need to go back, but I was not about to let our narrative be erased. And here's why. What separates policy and people is humanity. It is so easy to make policy in the Ronald Reagan building or the I don't know what building in Washington, D.C. It is another thing to be among the human beings who are implementing the policy and impacted by the policy. The policies that were made by my government literally killed people. And I wanted no one to die in vain. What I learned about the humanity of foreign policy is that it often requires extraordinary resilience to get through. And this is a theme that I think resonates today, and I will get back to it. But first, let me tell you about part one. 3 parts to this book. Part one is what happened at the moment the bomb goes off. Now picture this. We're in this building. What happened if right now a bomb went off? Boom. Okay. It's one thing to be in Washington, D.C. It's another thing to be in Nairobi, Kenya. When this bomb went off, the authorities were so overwhelmed with the extent of the damage and the injuries, there was no one who was going to take care of people in our embassy except the people in the embassy. Those who managed to survive, I think we had probably 50% casualties. Some of them were wounded, those who were not wounded and managed to escape the building, organized on the front step of the building and became their own first responders to go back, to stay with the wounded, take some of them, as many as we could, out, and eventually to take out the body parts of colleagues. Our medical unit immediately set up a triage unit on the sidewalk, and our colleagues in other agencies, especially those in AID, turned themselves into hospital and morgue search teams to search for the humans the missing we had lost. Others turned themselves into condolence groups to field the telephone calls of hundreds of panicked family members wanting to learn what happened to their families. And still others turned into crisis managers for chaos and hundreds of visitors that eventually came. I wanted to tell their story because it's a heck of a story. I also describe what it was, how I got there, because it's not that in 1998 there were a whole lot of women ambassadors. There still are not a whole lot of women ambassadors. We have more work to do on that. So I go back and I talk about what it was like to essentially be what is now called a third culture kid I was raised in the Foreign Service in Germany, France, Pakistan, and Iran, returned to this country in 1965 and went into total culture shock, as anyone who has gone through the 60s would see. Eventually became a management trainer, a feminist, joined the Foreign Service, and my first job was responsibility for shipping and customs in Dakar, Senegal. And my friends, you can't get a whole lot lower than shipping and customs. But you do learn a lot. And I moved up through the hierarchy. And before going to Nairobi, was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs in the Department of State, responsible for all cross-cutting issues in 46 African countries. So I had conflict, I had disease, I had drugs, thugs, humanitarian intervention, and yes, women were considered a cross-cutting issue at that time. So when I went to Nairobi, Richard and I had had experience in the Foreign Service. We had experience in my background as a management trainer and leader, and we went into Nairobi with a leadership agenda that included lifting morale, because we were told, oh, Nairobi, it's a bad morale post. Always has been bad morale, always will be bad morale. Well, let me tell you, if you ever get into a place that has traditionally bad morale, you have got a wonderful leadership opportunity in front of you, which is to do something about it. Because Washington at the time had decided, policymakers had decided that nothing good would ever come while Daniel Arap Moi was president. Goodbye, good luck, don't write us, we won't write you. Let me tell you, if you are on the policy side of the US government in which nobody has interest, you have a wonderful leadership opportunity because nobody cares. We decided, number one, to promote community, and number two, to establish delicious policy goals with a very large group of federal agencies also in Nairobi. And for 2 years, we were focused on that, while I was also focused on getting attention to an embassy that was clearly vulnerable, having spent so many times in so many countries looking at conflict and vulnerability. I knew a bad embassy when I saw one, and this was it. We had no setback from the sidewalk, none. Sidewalk, 5 steps, open the door, and you're looking at post 1 where the Marines were. It took me a nanosecond the first day to recognize this was a dangerous embassy, and I spent 2 years writing the Department of State, telling them that this was vulnerable, and being told ultimately that I should stop nagging, end quote. People were getting tired of my letters, my cables, and be quiet. That only filled me with more passion, if you will, after the bombing took place. And we found ourselves literally in the rubble and had no choice but to pull ourselves out. And I saw a community exhibit resilience, the likes of which I hadn't seen and I had the honor to participate in. The first part talks about how we did that. One of the things I had to do is to take charge. As a woman, all of the surveys say that men and women think that women should take care and men should take charge. And when women take charge, they become Hillary Clinton. She is my example of what happens to a woman who ran for president and took charge. We don't like them, we're suspicious, they're not friendly, etc. I am here to tell you that if you want to take care, you need to take charge. 3 different aircraft had mechanical difficulties. 3 different aircrafts of rescuers didn't reach us until Sunday, blown up 10:30 Friday morning, nothing happened till Sunday. We were all by ourselves. Suddenly, Every airplane arrived, and we had literally hundreds of people. One of my senior team members came and said, "Ambassador, I'm going to resign. It's chaos out there and no one will listen to me." Another senior team member, who also happened to be our security officer, came in with steam coming out of his ears saying that my badge was blown up in the old embassy and the new people who have just taken over have forbidden me to come in the building because I don't have a badge. I, by the way, appropriated the F word for myself because I thought it would have more power if a female ambassador used it. In this case, I walked into the bullpen where hundreds of folks were milling about, and I had top spouse who has military experience call attention, and I said, "Take a good look at me. I am the chief of mission. And nothing happens unless I say it, and if I'm not here, here's the person who is my deputy, and nothing happens unless he says it," and it worked. Later on, I found my job to be setting the tone and providing the kind of model that you want in order to keep people going. As an example, I would give people permission to cry. In fact, I recommended that people go home and cry because I didn't need a stiff upper lip organization that was going to burn out. I needed people who knew how to take care of themselves. I tried to model that and announced, and by the way, I had an all-male senior staff, so I was the only woman, which gave me lots of latitude and opportunities for learning and teaching. And I said at the end of one of our staff meetings that I had been introduced to Reiki. Anyone know Reiki? It's a chi using energy hands-on. And I was finding it helpful, and maybe they would too. And 3 of the guys followed me out and said, "Ambassador, we're very happy that you're following the Reiki program and it's working. We're following the RAD program and it's working for us." Anyone heard of the RAD program? Repression, Alcohol, and Denial. And it did work for some people. And that was part of the challenge we all had to work with. Whatever we did, we got through it, which is why in part 2, I wanted to explore how could this have happened to begin with? How could a jihadist living in a cave in Afghanistan assault 2 embassies in East Africa and get away with it with impunity? And that is what part 2 talks about. By the time Richard and I were researching the book, 9/11 had started, the war on terrorism was going and going and going and going. And we had trial transcripts from some of our perpetrators who were captured and brought to justice. We had memoirs from smiling Washington officials at the time. And we had lots of investigative reporting and the 9/11 Commission. And we spent years looking back through the information to tease out that part that related to August 7th. Because no one had done anything about August 7th. We were merely a breadcrumb on the way to the witch's house. What I learned was that by the end of 1996, the point at which I was the US ambassador in Nairobi, the National Security Council was beginning to wage a covert war on Osama bin Laden. A walk-in who had come into one of our embassies in the spring, summer of 1996 from al-Qaeda had given information that had enabled the US intelligence and the FBI to connect Osama bin Laden with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, with the attack on the Black Hawk helicopter made famous by Black Hawk Down in Somalia in 1993. They knew that he had a violent terrorist network around the world. that he was looking for arms and chemical weapons, and yes, there was a cell in Nairobi. I had been told that there was a branch office in Nairobi. I had also been told that bin Laden was a financier, and we were trying to disrupt his operations. No one told me anything further. In 1997, when a team of CIA, FBI came to Kenya to disrupt the branch office and to try and flip the American who was serving as the director of that office, and left the team, left with information from the director's hard drive, dismantled the office. I was told that al-Qaeda in Kenya was no more. Actually, al-Qaeda in Kenya was still planning to bomb us, and the information was in the hands of the authorities. Had the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and the National Security Council shared information with one another, with the United States ambassador in Nairobi and the Kenyan authorities, I'm not sure that August 7th would have happened. Had anybody done a review after we were blown up, I'm not sure 9/11 would have happened, because the same problems and dysfunctionalities that enabled al-Qaeda to attack the homeland were already extant 3 years earlier. So what? We are now in 2018. My book starts in 98, it ends in 2017. We're now 2018. So what? What in the world does it matter? As Dr. Shank said, I began talking about leadership and the lessons learned. I set up a leadership school in a college, and I've started talking about the experience and found that a lot resonates, and this is what particularly resonates. 17 years after 9/11 and 20 years after we were blown up in Kenya, we still don't have a no-fault lessons learned process that will enable us to learn about policy failures. And if there is a policy failure currently going on in this country, one of them is the war on terrorism that has now cost us trillions of dollars, added 10% to the deficit, killed 7,000 American soldiers. And did you read the other day that our suicide rate among veterans is 25 people a day? Hello. We have killed and displaced millions of people. And we're told there is no end in sight. Well, I don't call that a policy success. So what we needed to do in 1998, we still need to do in 2018. In 2018, we still need to provide more respect and resources to people who get things done in this world without guns. Guns are never going to stop an ideology, and war is not going to stop a tactic of terrorizing civilians. There are peaceful means of creating change, and in 1998 we needed it, and this year we still need it. We still need to pay attention to dissenters and stop dismissing women leaders. And finally, we still need to exercise resilience in the face of a difficult present. The bottom line of what Nairobi taught me is that we who work period, are often faced with the tension between doing the right thing and doing things right. My colleagues in Washington were doing the right thing by waiving security requirements in order to stay in the budget. And in fact, they advanced their careers by doing that. I was trying to do things right. And do both things right and the right thing by telling Washington what was wrong. And once that didn't work and the worst happened, it was resilience that showed us through, and that, I think, is still a resonant proposition for today. I thank you for listening and welcome your questions. A silence comes over the room.
Madam Ambassador.
Hello.
It was amazing just listening to, just opened my eyes, and I guess my brain is sparkling in a way that I did not think before. I'm a new immigrant to the United States, and I am here with World Affairs Council in Washington, D.C. So many of the things you just mentioned are from the time you were serving in Kenya are very similar to what we see, like how news is focused on one story and like few days later you never hear from that story because there's so much other things going on. And in my view, coming from a Middle Eastern country, I think media is giving too much attention to many unnecessary stories. What's your, if you could, or you would advise or consult, give advice to the current administration? I actually think some of the policies that are going on right now may again put the American nation in danger. I hope nothing similar to 9/11, nothing at all happens, but how could we make sure nothing like that happens? Like, what's your advice to the current administration with the similarities of the policy making and the news cycle and everything that is happening right now?
Number one, I think that we're not going to see a lot of diplomatic facilities blown up anymore after Benghazi and the political drama that was made of that. So I think that diplomats are pretty secure. It is, we have a president who has been elected on a transactional foreign policy. It's an American first foreign policy. There are people who disagree with it, and we will see the results of it in the elections. In the meantime, as I say, I think that all Americans need to, I've learned that there is, in the middle of a political hurricane that can be going on, it is possible to not just survive, but to carve out meaningful goals and create community among diverse people and keep moving on because situations change all the time. This is not forever. And when this is gone, where are we going to be and what are we going to do and how well prepared are we going to be to do it? I hope that answers your question.
Good evening, Ambassador Bushnell. My name is Patrick Realisa. I'm with the UN Association here in Washington, D.C. I serve as Vice Chair for our Peace and Security Committee, so it's very relevant on what you kind of discuss. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on the global goals, and specifically Global Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. Obviously the United States has its own problems, but how can organizations such as the United Nations, especially through its initiatives of the global goals, can help achieve peace and security here and abroad?
One of the leaps that I think that my generation is passing on to your generation and other generations is the need to move beyond concern strictly for national security and start looking at human security. Climate change is not a national security issue, it's a human security issue. The war on terrorism is a human security issue. It is not just a national security issue. And I will continue as long as I'm alive to participate in ventures like this, but we really do need you and people of your generation to move us beyond the parochial thinking we have been engaged in recently.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ambassador, for your presentation. And I think you have been traveling so much around the world, and civilization and high tech and transportation is really make the world smaller. But on the other hand, I think this world is getting weirder and weirder. So I just wonder, could you, based on your experience and based on your collections of people talking about each other, and what do you think, which country have some strengths, which country have some weakness in your judgment? So just the comparison to the United States, see if we can help some understanding and make some better peace in this world and have a better friendly atmosphere.
You know, what I found was, although I represented the United States government, I really am a person of peace of the world. And I think, honestly, I get back to what I said earlier, that the competition among governments is not necessarily going to get us where all of us who live on this earth and want good things for our children. If governments can help, and if governments are not helping, we need to correct them. And more increasingly, we need to be thinking as a global society, so if our international institutions aren't working, let's do something about it. But I'm very hesitant to put one country in front of the other in terms of strengths and weaknesses, because we all have both, and we need to focus on everyone's strengths.
Thank you.
Good evening, Ambassador. Thank you for coming. It was very insightful, your experience. This question is going to be dealing with the day of the incident. I would like to know, what was your first call of action, your first task that you assigned, or you tried doing as immediate after the incident? And I would also like to know if the relationships between the U.S. and Kenyans, there was some drawback after the incident, considering that they might have put some blame on the embassy himself.
The very first thing I did, once I collected myself and got to the what had been set up as the crisis center, was to grab a embassy telephone book and put it into the hands of somebody and say, find every one of our people. That is the very first thing you want to do in crisis, right? As a family, as a community, where are our people? So that was number one. What happened at the time of the bombing was that our Marines, most embassies have a 6-member Marine detachment. They are there to protect the paper, not the people, but they are also there to provide perimeter security. And within minutes of the bombing, our Marines and some people from the military who were there temporarily did what they were trained to do. They donned their helmets, their flak jackets, they got their guns, and they went outside to provide the security perimeter. What the Kenyans saw, people who were coming by the thousands to look at what happened, to try and rescue people, and what they saw were a bunch of white guys with guns pointing at them. It created a public affairs crisis that I dealt with for my remaining time in Kenya. It is one of these things, crises often just keep delivering bad news. Nobody was wrong. I was so proud, number one, that they did what they were trained to do, and number two, that they didn't kill anybody, because we had just been blown up and we had thousands of people coming our way, and these were young men who were facing a huge crowd. They didn't panic. They were quite determined. And Kenyans, I understand completely. In their hour of greatest need, they saw us doing nothing to help them. In part because, well, entirely because they could not see the amount of damage done on the inside. So crises are going to create disruptions in your relationships. It happens. And the next thing is, what do you do about it? And I will tell you, there is nothing, what I did was to listen to their anger, because it was a righteous anger. Nobody was at fault, and if they had to come down on me as the face of the U.S. government, well, then that was okay, because I understood, and I didn't shy away from it, and ultimately I left, and the friendship between our two countries was in really good shape.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Hi.
I really liked how you spoke on how the minute you reached to the embassy, you said that you knew immediately that it was in a vulnerable state, and that you had written many times that you were seeking extra security, but then you just said you didn't want to be a nag. And I guess being as a female today and being in politics and stuff, we always feel like you sound like a nag, which kind of sucks. But it's really admirable that now we need to be taken seriously. But I do have a question. Do you have any knowledge of the former Green Beret FBI CIA informant who set up the Nairobi cell, who's now in witness protection program?
Are you talking about Ali Mohammed?
Ali Mohammed, yeah.
Oh, yeah. All right, y'all want to know about Ali Mohammed? Oh my God, what a guy. No kidding. This is a man who was in the Egyptian military. His unit was involved in the assassination of Anwar Sadat. Ali Mohammed, I call him Ali Mo, just to, Ali Mo goes to Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is now the head of al-Qaeda, and was the head of an Egyptian jihadist movement. And Zawahiri sends him to Hamburg, where Ali Mo is hired by the CIA to be an informant at the local mosque. Ali Mo also tells other people at the mosque that he's a CIA informant, not knowing that they had another informant. He is then fired by the CIA, but he nonetheless gets a visa, special visa, to come to the United States. He is on the airplane, and my friends, he sits next to a single woman from California, and yes, 6 weeks later, they are married. And he has set up a cell in Santa Clara County. He then joins, as a former major in the Egyptian army, he joins the American army as a recruit, ends up in Fort Bragg as a supply sergeant, and begins to, while he is giving lectures on fundamentalist Islam to the troops, he is stealing training materials and training jihadists, al-Qaeda jihadists in New York. He also becomes an FBI informant in California, which enables him to travel around. I know you're saying, oi, exactly. Oh my God, really? This is quite a guy. He travels around the country, bringing Zawahiri in to not only set up cells, but also to fundraise for the jihadist. He takes a break from military service, says, I'm taking my 30 days leave, actually it was 90-day leave, I'm going over to Afghanistan to kill some Russians. They said, whoa, wait a minute, you can't do that. He says, watch me. He does, he comes back. There, he eventually gets an honorable discharge, and he becomes the man who helps to train the al-Qaeda people who bring the Black Hawk down from Somalia. He set up, as you pointed out, he sets up helps to set up the cell in Nairobi, and he is the one who surveils the embassy and shows Osama bin Laden the picture of the American embassy, and bin Laden says, what an easy place that is to blow up. The truck bomb can go exactly, boom, here. Eventually, Ali Mohammed, after the bombing, was arrested on a John Doe warrant. He was brought up to trial and has never been heard of since. He has disappeared into our justice system.
He was prosecuted in 2000 in New York and is now believed to be in witness protection program. So my question is, how does a person like that just disappear from the papers and is believed to be in witness protection program after they've been prosecuted in American soil in New York in 2000?
That's the book you're going to write.
Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, first of all, I have to say that I've been looking forward to this book for months. So I wasn't aware that it's coming out in October, but I was 12 when the attacks happened. I'm from Kenya. My father was working at the embassy, and we're just so fortunate that he survived the blast. So he saw half his department, not survive, and yes, without reliving the trauma of that experience. That inspired me to do my PhD program, which is Terrorism, Horn of Africa. And as I'm kind of navigating my research, I do have a couple of questions, and I love speaking with policymakers and former ambassadors like you who did a great job, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm just curious to your thoughts about the counterterrorism efforts and if you think those to be effective at all, and just how you've kind of coped with the aftermath of such a life-changing incident.
Well, we need to hug each other afterwards. I'm so glad your parents survived. Well, the first thing we need to do is to decide what in the world is terrorism. Do you know there is no international definition of what a terrorist, who a terrorist is. So a terrorist in one country is a freedom fighter in another, and in a lot of countries they put label terrorist on anyone you disagree with. Truly, until we know what it is we don't like, we can't possibly come up with a solution to fight it. So that I leave to your generation. Let me know if I can help. I'll be happy to do so. And as to getting through this, it comes back to resilience, and resilience comes down to community. I could never have survived without my husband, my family, my community. I could never have survived without knowing I did the right thing, which was to keep the issue of vulnerability in front of the American government, even though it cost me a lot, because I was forgiven. And as the person who had the responsibility for the lives of Americans and Kenyan employees and failed in my mission, the fact that I kept pushing back was very important. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Madam Ambassador. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate hearing from you, as I too have ambition to hopefully contribute to the Foreign Service someday. So my name is Katie, and I'm working in Washington, but recently graduated from Syracuse University. And over the past year, I've served as a remembrance scholar in memory of the victims of the 1988 bombing of a flight that unfortunately blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland. So I learned through my research and the past year of learning how to remember the 35 Syracuse students who were on their way home from studying abroad when the incident happened, how it is such an important part to be part of a community. And us almost generations later now, still trying to remember and finding meaningful ways to remember. So I was wondering for you, what advice you might have for future either remembrance scholars or children of people who were the victims of, the Kenyan bombing and so many other terrorism incidents. What could you recommend, or how could you recommend finding ways to sustain the community beyond just the big anniversary years, and in a meaningful way that will help both the victims and the memories live on even longer?
Tell your story. In commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the bombing, the Foreign Service Journal, by the way, if you are interested in stories of survivors and those who came to help, the Foreign Service Journal, July, August 2018 copy is the one to read. We went out and we asked people 4 questions. Where were you? What impact did it have? What helped you to create a new normal? And what advice would you have for people who may be survivors of terrorist attacks? We got 40 stories. There are a lot of lessons. And what I have learned is that the media and even social media is in such a hurry, and we forget everything 10 minutes later. Collect the stories for the children and the grandchildren, and there are lessons in there.
Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador.
Hello.
Thank you for your comments. I was wondering if it would be possible to comment on how Foreign Service officers are prepared to show resilience in times of crisis, if that, how that might have changed after the Kenya bombings, and if there are still areas to be improved in this.
Yes, there are areas to be improved, and now the State Department runs a resilience program that is doing a really good job and is getting an extraordinary amount of business these days. The issue of recognizing post-traumatic stress and the effects that trauma has on our brain still needs to be appreciated and recognized and not stigmatized.
Thank you.
Madam Ambassador, I want to say that I was really inspired by what you had to say about women in leadership roles. And as a new Foreign Service, a new employee with the Foreign Service, heading to my first post in a few months, I was wondering if you could share some advice about what I, as a woman, can do to maybe help implement some of the changes that you see are necessary in the Foreign Service.
First of all, women diplomats can say things male diplomats can never get away with. Because there is such a different relationship and we don't have that immediate threat or hierarchical. So a lot of men think we're really stupid, so they have to say a lot of things to us, and we can take a whole lot of information. So, Joe, tell me about yourself. 45 minutes later, you can write a cable saying, by the way, you know, King Joe just said, blah. So, number one, we know we have social skills. Number two, we can actually, for the first 3 months, the president of Kenya refused to see me because I was a woman, and I had to have my boss, the assistant secretary, tell the president, please see the U.S. ambassador, which was absolutely humiliating. But once we got together, especially when we were not there, we could have conversations the likes of which no other man could have. And we would get into arguments, and we were in the middle of one argument. It got to the point where his staff would say to me, oh, Ambassador, when you go in, would you please tell the president that he really needs to do things? Blah, blah, blah. I would say, well, wait a minute, I'm the U.S. ambassador, I'm not his cabinet member. Oh, but he listens to you. Well, actually, he yells at me. Well, that means he's listening. So the next time I'm in there, he starts yelling, and I interrupt him, and I said, you know, President, we're having another argument. Yes, I know. We have lots of arguments. Yes, I know. Well, how is it for you? Only a woman could say that, right? Well, so how is it for you? I like it. I am a Democrat. So by all means, we have, it is, as a woman, I found it difficult to get over, to get to equal recognition. But once I got to equal recognition and representing the United States, government helps get you equal recognition. I found that being a woman was extraordinarily advantageous. In any way, that's what I am, so why not make the best of it?
Thank you.
Plus, I never wore black. Again, only a woman could do this. After the bombing, I only wore pink and green and purple and red because I wanted that murdering so-and-so to know I was in the pink. A man can't do that. Many ways we can communicate. So welcome to a wonderful adventure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to stop. Thank you for coming. And I want to show you this book. This is what the book looks like. I want to get back to how important community is, policy, and people. This is me. You are looking at a leader who was experiencing a colossal policy failure. This was about 7 days after the bombing, when the Israeli Defense Forces, which had come with sniffer dogs to look at, particularly to find survivors in the 7-story office building, had determined there were none left and held a brief ceremony. I went there. Richard is actually by my side, but alas, he wasn't the ambassador, so he was cut out. This photograph won the 1999 Pulitzer Prize for photography. I connected with the photojournalist over LinkedIn and asked if I could use his photograph for my book because it said 1,000 words. And he replied literally within 20 minutes and said, "You can have it for whatever use. Thank you for your service. Please send my mother a signed copy of your book." Community is here. Underneath all of this terrible incivility we are told we're going through, a human being is willing to give me an award-winning photograph for service. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening.